Hey Cyberclass, it's Professor Opterbeck. I'm just making a video here to give you some highlights and some background from the 2023 Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report and from the IBM Cost of a Data Breach Report. As I said when I assigned these, you do have to register to get them, but they're really industry standard reports. And they're really important reading for you in this field to kind of keep up with. So it's really worth getting a copy. So let's take a look first at some highlights from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. Now, one thing I want to note about both of these reports, they are industry standards, but of course they're not perfect or infallible. They each have their own methodologies, their own data sets. And if you are familiar with statistics, you could certainly criticize some aspects of the data sets and some aspects of the methodology, and that's fine. There are other ways of doing things, but these are generally thought of as at least broadly representative. The other thing I'll say is you're reading reports from a commercial entity like Verizon or like an IBM who are engaged in providing products and services that relate to the thing they're reporting about. So you do want to kind of keep in mind there's, I think these are reputable reports. It's not that there's an obvious kind of slant in the reports, but there is an extent to which reports like this are an exercise in FUD. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt is a phrase consultants and lawyers sometimes use. And there is a bit of, kind of funneling people toward the products and services, the solutions that an entity like Verizon or IBM might offer. I actually think you see that a little more in the IBM report when you read it. They're kind of suggesting that certain IBM products would be helpful, and they may well be helpful. But just keep that in mind as you read anything like this. And in this field, in the cybersecurity field in particular, as well as in the privacy field, you tend to get a lot of reports like this that are put out by companies that then are offering solutions, and many of them are really good. Just kind of keep that in mind. So a few things I want to note from the Verizon DBIR report. And you can see from the summary of findings, social engineering continues to be really one of the main vectors that bad guys use to get into a network. And when we talk about social engineering, we're talking about the human factor, right? So notice here, 74% of breaches involve the human element. So it is certainly the case that cybersecurity incidents are technological. Obviously there's software involved, there's malware involved, and so on. But that scene that you might see in the movies, where the hacker, whether it's a good guy or a bad guy, is kind of clicking on their computer and coding something and getting in the network. That's not really how most cybersecurity incidents today happen, or at least not how they begin. They begin with some exploitation of human vulnerabilities. So you've probably heard the term phishing. A phishing attack is one in which the bad guy is impersonating somebody or some institution that you trust. So it might be you get an email that looks like it comes from your bank. Spear phishing is a more targeted way of doing that. So you get an email that seems like it comes from the finance director of your organization. And you're not looking at it kind of carefully enough, and you maybe click on the link that is sent to you, and then that link delivers a payload of malware, because of course the original email doesn't really come from your bank or doesn't really come from your finance director. And this is a very, very common. And what that suggests, of course, is that one mitigation technique that's really important is education and awareness of people to be on guard for phishing attacks. I can tell you that in the last few weeks at the law school, I got an email that was sent to faculty that appeared to be from one of the computer science people at the IT people at the university, saying, I need you to look at this document. And it was a document from a Google Drive. And I just thought to myself, this person would not be sending me a document from Google Drive for any reason. And so I kind of recognized that it was a phishing attack. But I talked to a colleague who said, yeah, did you see that email? I kept trying to get into the document. I couldn't get into it. I kept entering it asked me for my password. I kept entering it, but it wouldn't let me in the document. And I said, well, I think you better talk with IT and security because it was a phishing attack. So even very, smart people can get caught up in this kind of thing. All right, so many breaches begin with social engineering. Of course, it then does deliver a payload of malware. Now, one thing you'll begin to learn in this part of the class, and you'll see it also in the excerpts from my paper that I asked you to look at. Malware is now a business, and indeed, malware as a service is now accessible. So you can go onto the dark web and buy pre-configured or lease or rent license pre-configured malware packages that you can then easily tweak without having any coding experience. It's kind of like any other software. All right, and you can see from here some of the different ways in which bad guys get in. Now, notice this figure, because we often talk in cybersecurity about external threats and internal threats. So we do want to be aware in cybersecurity about internal threats. And by threats here, we don't mean just that somebody might fall for a social engineering attack. That's always a problem. But we mean somebody on the inside is doing something malicious. So they're stealing money from the institution, something we have some familiarity with. Or they are, taking trade secrets to maybe bring to a new employer. And those kind of things happen. They matter, and we need to be on guard for them. But most attacks still involve external actors who are trying to get in. All right. This piece of the report, and again, I'm just jumping through some highlights. I want you to read the reports, and the quiz will have questions about information in the reports, but I want to highlight some things. Ransomware is one of the top things that bad guys are trying to do. So ransomware, as you may know, involves the bad guy getting into your network and then usually encrypting your network or some portion of your network so that you don't have access to the information you need in order to do your business. And then classically in a ransomware attack, the bad guy will say, I have encrypted all your data and you need to pay me X amount, usually a Bitcoin, X amount of Bitcoin in order for me to release the data to you, to decrypt it. We are now increasingly seeing ransomware attacks where the bad guy says, if you want me to decrypt your data, and also I will release your data publicly if you don't pay the ransom. So it's another kind of a way of holding the data hostage. So this is one of the largest things that's happening now. And when you look at my paper, I have what I think is a plausible explanation for this. Now, I don't have statistical sort of correlations to back this up, but it's intuitive to me, and I think it makes sense. Why is ransomware rising? Part of the reason is because the kind of previous classical version of attacks. So the previous classical version is take the data, credit card information, for example, social security numbers, for example, sell that data on the dark web, and or monetize that data, by engaging in credit card transactions using those stolen credit card numbers. And as I explain in my paper that I asked you to look at, the dark web is really saturated now. The value of that kind of information for any individual record on the dark web, your social security number or mine, for example, is pretty small. And that's just a function of supply and demand. There's an oversupply of that right now. So it's quite a bit more profitable in many cases for bad guys to do ransomware, because you're not reselling the data on the dark web, you're simply getting the ransom. And the fact is, people pay the ransoms because you need to get yourself up and running again. We'll talk in a bit when we look at the IBM report about whether law enforcement gets involved and how that works. All right. This piece from the DBIR report talks about the motivations of attackers. And again, look at my paper. I talk about this a little bit as well. And not surprisingly, overwhelmingly in the incidents that Verizon looked at, the biggest motivation is financial. In other words, the bad guys want to get money. There is some percentage that is identifiable as espionage. So a foreign government, usually China, sometimes North Korea, sometimes associated with Russia, is trying to get information for purposes of espionage. There still is some hacktivism, so ideologically someone wants to expose some information. A small percentage is just a grudge, you're trying to get back at somebody, and some of it is undefinable. Most of it is financial, some of it is espionage. Now this figure from the Verizon report, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with, or just try and nuance a little bit. And I talk about this in my paper too. So it's correct, most of this activity is organized crime. So there are individuals who are engaged in this kind of activity. A lot of times an insider attack is some inside individual. But the networks that are engaged in this activity are large, are sophisticated, are organized. And that's one of the reasons that it's really hard. This is a hard problem to respond to. It's one of the reasons that the criminal law of computer crimes that we're looking at over the next couple of weeks is necessary but not really a sufficient way of responding, because it's very hard to break up organized crime, and in particular it's international organized crime. And here's the place where I want to nuance a bit the Verizon report. So notice that the Verizon report has about 15% or so, 10 to 15% or so being nation state or state affiliated. Now, if we take this to mean that the motivation is strictly for direct nation state purposes and the actors are identifiable as, the Chinese military hacking unit or the North Korean military hacking unit, that's makes sense, right? And if you look at this espionage figure, you can see that the percentages, right, are roughly correlated there. That makes sense. The thing that I want to bring out, though, is that many of these organized crime groups, particularly what we call RBUC, Russian-based organized crime, ultimately are connected in complicated ways to the nation state. So if you have a Russian organized crime group, the way the Russian government works as an oligarchy, that organized crime group has ties to the government. Now, it isn't a government hacking group, probably. And there is a Russian military unit that is a hacking unit, right? And that would fall in the nation state category, but that organized crime group is still connected. You really can't disentangle the organized crime from the state in Russia. Now, we would often say this about Ukraine also in the past, before the war. So we want to be careful about that because of the war, and I personally agree with the Western posture of supporting Ukraine in that war against Russia, but it's complicated. The organized crime network problem is a really complicated one, and the same is true to some extent in China. And I think it's a bit more direct, I suppose, in China. There isn't the same kind of oligarchy with organized crime groups basically almost running the government in the same way in China. But to the extent there are organized crime groups that are not direct state actors in China, they're also affiliated with the state. Last thing from the DBIR report is interesting kind of emphasis over the past couple of years really on virtual currencies. Now we all know, of course, that cryptocurrencies were sort of really hot for a while, and then with the whole Sam Bankman-Fried thing, they've taken quite a hit. But nevertheless, cryptocurrency, first of all, remains a coin of the realm for cyber criminals to use, for example, in collecting ransomware, but also now is an opportunity for cyber criminals to exploit. And this can involve both directly taking cryptocurrency, breaking into the cryptocurrency itself and exploiting that. But really more often it involves the applications that people are using to manage their cryptocurrencies or exchange their cryptocurrency. So in many ways it's similar to attacks, and I mentioned these in my paper, on traditional brokerage accounts. So there are ways in which cyber criminals can break into your stock brokerage account or your retirement account and siphon funds out of that. That's a little difficult for the criminals. It's a little dicier because it's a bit more traceable in some ways. So this is another issue, and it's a kind of if you're interested in cryptocurrencies, the whole security aspect is a piece to think about. So now let's look at some highlights from the IBM Cost of a Data Breach report. Again, you can certainly quibble with methodology and with the sample set and all of that, but it's a helpful benchmark. So average cost, total cost of a breach, IBM says is $4.45 million. And a thing to note is that this is increasing. So the average cost of a breach is increasing. Now, on the one hand, you might say, okay, I get that. Cybersecurity continues to be a major problem. We look at the Verizon report, we see that, overall incidents are on the rise. And so I might not be surprised that the cost of a breach is on the rise as well. On the other hand, if you were to step back a bit and say, all right, we've known cybersecurity is a major problem. We've known it's been a problem for about 20 years. We know it's been a major problem, for about 15 years. And so, we might expect that, let's do some kind of curve here. We might expect to see some kind of, decline in the cost of a data breach, even if the number of incidents is continuing to rise, because we would expect that, the mitigation efforts would be getting better. We would expect that. We know this is a real problem. The ability to identify that there's been a breach, to plug the hole, to remediate the breach should be getting better and better. And, in some respects, the technology of that is getting better and better, but the bad guys get better too. And so to some extent, we're still not taking maybe cybersecurity as seriously as we should, and or we're kind of letting it be a cost of doing business. But to some extent, there's kind of an arms race, and that's part of the problem of cyber. Just the scale of the problem, the amount of incidents that happen, and the resources you can afford to devote to it, and the sophistication of the bad guys makes it really difficult to kind of keep those, to have a curve like this on those costs, instead of, having a curve that looks something like this on those costs. All right. Here is over time the cost of a data breach, right? So you can just see those costs going up. And one slide we have here is the total overall cost. It's interesting to look at the per record cost. In other words, this is the cost for each individual record that is exfiltrated as the result of a breach. So if a breach results in 1 million credit card numbers getting taken, mine and yours and 1 million others, then each individual credit card, and again, this is not the cost of the consumer, this is the cost to the entity that suffers the breach. And you can see that cost also continues to rise, although it is starting to level off a little bit. And I find it interesting to look at this because, as you know, I do a lot of work on data breach kind of law and policy, and I've done some empirical work looking at settlements, and we'll look at this in a few weeks, looking at settlements, class action settlements of data breach cases. And, what you're trying to do there is look at kind of the harm to the consumer for their individual record. And at the same time, so the companies are having to deal with that on the settlement to reimburse the consumer, or at least, pay some kind of class settlement. At the same time, they have other costs that they're dealing with. This from the IBM report shows the cost per industry. Now, you might wonder, okay, why would it cost more than others? And some of this involves the value of the information that can be taken. Some of it involves regulatory costs. So if you think of healthcare, first of all, you've got some very valuable, potentially valuable information to the bad guys and costly to the individual consumer. But secondly, you have HIPAA. And HIPAA is the privacy law that in the US that protects health information. We'll touch on this a little bit later in the semester. So you have additional regulatory costs, right? Similar in financial. You have financial records. They're very valuable to the bad guys. They're valuable to the industry. They're costly to the consumer, right? All that involves different aspects of reimbursement the company's going to have to do. And there are also regulatory costs. So you can take a bit at this, look at this. This is a really useful graphic in what it costs, or how the costs are broken up around the company. So, notice that we're not only talking here about the post-breach response. Right here we have the post-breach response. So the post-breach response is going to be, all right, now I know that a breach has happened. I have to probably hire some outside firms. I probably need a law firm. I probably need a forensic firm to try and help me figure out exactly what happened and then to plug the holes. I may need to provide some reimbursement to my customers, whether ultimately in a class settlement or before that. So I have all of that kind of stuff going on. And then I have costs of notification. We will talk a little bit later in the semester about in the US, state data breach notification laws and what you have to do to notify individuals in the different states whose records are affected, so you have that. So this is what you would sort of immediately think of. But IBM is including these costs, which is lost business. And that's a significant part of this. I as a business am devoting resources to dealing with cybersecurity and security incidents and breaches that I otherwise could, devote somewhere else. So I have both direct costs of that and I have opportunity costs of that. And then the effort and cost of actually detecting that a breach has happened and the immediate steps of dealing with the fact that the breach has happened before I get to what IBM is calling the post-breach. So just to take away from this, and as a lawyer, whether you're going to be in-house at a company or outside counsel representing companies, to communicate to the client, and in particular when you're doing compliance, there's a couple of pieces to the legal side of this, to the compliance side of this. And a big part of it is being prepared in the beginning, right? Trying to be ready to be compliant with applicable standards and laws, to be prepared for when the breach happens. By the way, it's not if an incident happens, it's when. The scale of this is too large to avoid. So there's that piece, and then there's the piece, okay, something has happened, we have to respond. So you have both of those things, and it's useful for you as the lawyer and for the client to kind of understand, here's why we have to do this, right? Here's the whole scale of what we're facing. I want to note, by the way, I've been using the phrase incident and I've been using the phrase breach. And I'm just going to try with my mouse to just real quickly write incident and breach. And when you're working in this space, you want to be aware of this distinction. Any intrusion is an incident. Any intrusion is an incident into your network. Any attempted intrusion into your network is an incident. So any phishing attack, even if no one bites on the email, is an incident. Somebody knew enough, right, to put that phishing email together. And likewise, if somebody clicks on it, there's some malware downloaded, there's an incident. So any intrusion or attempted intrusion is an incident. Not every intrusion or attempted intrusion is a breach. A breach is the disclosure of some sensitive information, including personally identifiable information, that requires a particular kind of response. If it's PII, personally identifiable information, there's going to have to be some notification at the very least to the individuals whose information was disclosed. If it's sensitive business information like trade secrets, there's going to have to be some response. We'll talk about this later in the semester, but it's really important to have an incident response, breach response plan. And part of that plan is going to be what are the factors that require the organization to declare a breach. When we have declared that an incident is a breach, then in our plan, different things are going to kick in. Different people are going to get involved. Insurance carriers might be notified. Notifications might have to go out. If we have an incident that we're not declaring as a breach, then not all of those same things are going to happen. This slide shows the types of information that was compromised in the samples that IBM was looking at. Customer PII remains the biggest compromised thing. That is the thing that tends to be most valuable to the bad guys, whether it is information they're exfiltrating and then reselling on the dark web or reusing, like credit card numbers and social security numbers, or whether it is information that they're holding for ransom. Employee PII, right, another category of PII, likewise has similar value. There is a lot of intellectual property theft. A lot of this is connected with those nation-state actors. So that continues to happen, and that includes trade secrets. Anonymized customer data here, non-PII, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the semester. This is a place where you might distinguish an incident versus a breach. Right? A breach would be PII has been disclosed. Anonymized PII means it's really not PII. There's no personally identifying information. And again, later in the semester, we talk about kind of compliance practices. We'll talk about de-identifying information and how that might help. All right, so just useful to see. Again, PII remains kind of the biggest target, though for some actors, intellectual property, including trade secrets, is important. Time to identify and contain a breach. This can be, for many people when they first see it, and many clients when they first see it, kind of a really shocking set of statistics. And this one in the IBM information, the light purple here is the time it takes to identify that the breach has happened, and the darker is the time it takes to contain what has happened, right? To stop the breach, to plug the hole. And notice in all of these, the bad guys are on the system, usually for quite a while, for periods of months, before it's identified that they're on the system. And this is a continuing problem. Again, you would expect maybe that over the course of time, this time to identify would be some kind of downward sloping graph, because our technology of identifying and our efforts to identify presumably should get better. But it isn't, right? It's a graph that is continuing to remain flat or even to tick up a little bit. Why is that? It's a couple of things. I mean, part of it is sort of resources and culture. How much effort are we going to spend to monitoring our own networks? Part of it, again, is this technological arms race and the fact that malware payloads can be difficult sometimes to identify. Now, why do the bad guys kind of sort of sit on a system so long? Well, sometimes they're just continuing to collect information. Sometimes they're waiting for the opportune moment till they have the kind of access they want. The bad guys often are kind of getting one place of access and then trying to use that to get to another place till they get to something that's valuable enough and big enough to, say, encrypt for ransomware or something like that. I mean, you can see also that even once identified, it still takes quite a while to contain. This is one of the reasons those costs are of a breach still are on average pretty high, because it's not easy to contain. Most organizations can't do it themselves. They have to hire outside consultants. And even organizations that are large enough potentially to do it by themselves, because there are legal risks, you're going to have to hire counsel, you're going to have to hire the right kinds of experts to retain privilege and other things, and it's not necessarily easy to do. It's also difficult to contain because, once the attacker is really in there for that long, right, there's kind of a spider web or a set of tentacles that's into the organization. So it's not just like usually just removing one file. It's a much bigger effort. This last slide that this last highlight that I'm going to show you has to do with ransomware. We'll come back to this later in the semester, and in our first summit, we will have someone from the New Jersey U.S. Attorney's Office meeting with us, and we can talk with them a little bit more about that. This is the question of responding to ransomware. Now, you might think, okay, ransomware, I get this thing from a bad guy, I can do a little bit of quick research on who's sending me this message, and I might realize, all right, this is part of an organized crime group, maybe a Russian organized crime group. They've been hitting people all over the country. Now I'm hit, and probably I should get the FBI involved, right? This is organized crime. Government's going to want to respond. They're going to be able to respond. But look, still most of the time, organizations do not involve law enforcement. Because most of the time, and this is sort of quiet and under the table, but most of the time organizations simply pay the ransom because it's the quickest, it still remains the quickest and easiest way to get your data back. You might think, well, why would I give an organized crime group my money? Can I trust them to get my data, to keep their word? No, you can't trust them. You may not have much of a choice. But oddly enough, with the better recognized groups and the better recognized attacks, it's not that you can trust them, but their business model involves doing what they said they're going to do. Because if the word gets out there that, in fact, you pay them and they don't release the data, well, then people are going to stop paying them. So it's a strange, market that has kind of developed. Now, is it legal to pay the ransom and not to get law enforcement involved? This is a gray area, and it's something you as outside or inside counsel will probably have to deal with if and when you deal with a ransomware attack. There are certain groups who are on U.S. government blacklists who are identified as terror organizations or state actors under sanctions or affiliated state actors under sanctions or individuals under sanctions who you can't pay ransom to without getting into trouble. But there are other groups where it's kind of gray and you could. When we speak with the person from the U.S. Attorney's Office, they'll probably tell us, and the FBI will say the same, you shouldn't pay the ransom, you should get law enforcement involved. And that may be good advice, but it's not the way most companies deal with it. By the way, we'll also talk about insurance later in the semester, and cyber insurance often includes some coverage actually for paying ransom, which again we can talk about when we get into later in the semester. So I wanted to give you these highlights, read through the reports, and I will See you online.